It's been calculated that Donald Trump plays golf on something like 120 days a year, which, if you think about it, is a pretty extraordinary amount of time.
Welcome to the State of It USA, the podcast that tries to make sense of Trump's America. Today we have something a little different. The outdoor offices are on, the children are out of school, so we thought we'd talk about the role of summer in American cultural and political life. Donald Trump is retreating to Bedminster for the break, and he joins a long tradition of American presidents who decamp but don't really completely switch off. Let's hear from George W. Bush.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Gerry, can you talk us through where the divide is? Do Democrats tend to go to one side of the country compared to Republicans on the other, or do we have more of a mix?
Yeah, Katy, well, presidential summers are very much part of the kind of the institution of American political life, actually. Presidents do like to get away from the White House, get out to their vacation homes. Of course, the work goes on when they go. It's a fascinating thing to do, as I've done it once or twice. They travel, of course, with the entire kind of press corps intact, not just the White House press corps. I mean, but the not just the White House press corps, but an entire staff of hundreds. And they have secure communications and everything else that you'd expect. But there is a sort of pattern in presidential vacations which sort of reflects the politics very much. We live in as we repeatedly said on this podcast, a very polarized partisan country, and it kind of applies to presidential vacations too. Of course, President Trump is on his vacation in Bedminster in New Jersey, which is now some people think that some people accuse Donald Trump of spending most of his time playing golf at one of his various resorts. He spends a lot of time, of course, particularly in the winter, down at Mar-a-Lago. But other presidents, have tended very much to sort of follow particular patterns. I remember for Democrats, there are particular parts of the country that have particular appeal for kind of liberal progressives. Bill Clinton, back in the 1990s, used to travel up to Martha's Vineyard. Martha's Vineyard is a very popular destination for liberal Democrats. It's a very liberal area. Barack Obama was very keen on Martha's Vineyard too, also a golfer. He would go up there and play golf a lot. Joe Biden, interestingly, he vacationed out on not far from Washington, D.C., actually Rehoboth Beach, which is in Delaware, about a 2-3 hour drive from Washington, D.C. We all remember the famous pictures of him falling off his bike while on vacation there. Republican presidents have taken a rather different approach, going to very much sort of really kind of escape sort of vacations. But they had different ideas of escapes. We just talked about Trump going to his own courses. Richard Nixon famously went down to Key Biscayne in Florida. Ronald Reagan had his Western White House. Of course, he was from California, had his White House out in near Santa Barbara. My favorite, though, recollection, and I did go there one summer, was George W. Bush, who used to vacation, believe it or not, in Crawford, Texas, where his house was not far from Waco. And one thing he would go and do is he would go and cut brush. He would spend his summer vacations walking through his enormous 10,000-acre farm, if you could call it a farm, going and cutting brush. And he used to find it very refreshing and very restorative. And I remember Tony Blair, you may recall, Katy, in the summer before the Iraq War, the summer of 2002, Tony Blair going and visiting him, and I don't think Tony Blair cut any brush, but it was an interesting example of the way how presidents spend their downtime.
I suppose another aspect of these holidays, Gerry, is we've also seen when they do leave the US, which obviously is rarer, but last year, for example, it almost became a MAGA British summer in the UK because you had Donald Trump coming over for Turnberry. You also had J.D. Vance, who of course is a vice president, and a few weeks later take what I think you might call a busman's holiday, whereby he went to the Cotswolds and met with Reform, the Tories, the foreign secretary, at which point you wonder what his wife might have been thinking that whole time.
Yeah, and it's true, but politically, again, Republicans, conservatives want their politicians to be doing really American things, like, cutting brush in Texas, or, hanging out on the beach in California or on the ranch in California where Reagan was. But I do remember Barack Obama, of course, was very friendly. All these Hollywood types, in particular George Clooney, who, of course, famously had his villa on the shores of Lake Como. But I do know that Democratic presidents often, were much more likely to flee the country. Although, as you mentioned, it was interesting that J.D. Vance in the Cotswolds last year, that might possibly just be another example of how J.D. Vance's political antenna are really not very good, because maybe someday that will come back to haunt him, to say that instead of J.D. Vance going and spending his summer vacations back home in Ohio on the lake, perhaps in Ohio, he went out and spent it with the great and the good of British society in the Cotswolds.
No, he now has a house in Middleburg, Virginia, or they're getting his property on a farm, which did slightly amuse me when I heard the news, because I remember going to Middleburg and then one night being in the local bar there, and this woman coming up to me being like, "Where have you come from?" And I said, "Well, I'm from Britain, but I live in DC." And she said, "Well, congratulations on finding the most English town in America."
Yeah, it's true. It
Land
really is.
top
It's
country.
horse country, isn't it? It's very,
So maybe J.D. Vance now doesn't need to go to the Cotswolds because he's found what they call almost the cheap version if you're an American and don't want to get the flight.
The whole phenomenon of American summer is fascinating, because although famously Americans, as we said, they don't get much vacation time, certainly not as much as Europeans. Summer is such an important element of their lives, and at the same time, Americans, they sort of there's always a fight in American politics about who's taking too much vacation. I can remember, Joe Biden famously, did take a lot of vacation, and there would be people who would be keeping track of exactly the number of days he would spend at his beach house out in Rehoboth, and it did turn out to be something like, I think, he spent something like 3 months in the year out at his beach house. And the same with Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump I think it's been calculated that Donald Trump spends, plays golf on something like 120 days a year, which, if you think about it, is a pretty extraordinary amount of time.
It's also, Gerry, as kind of you point to, it's a less pure form of holiday than perhaps what a UK Prime Minister takes, because with a UK Prime Minister, there's always, when are they going to take the holiday? And it becomes the game. Then it is, are they taking a week? 2 weeks is pretty unthinkable. And then there's always some kind of crisis, or there tends to be, or there's something that at least the press is saying is a crisis, which means they should cut their holiday short. And therefore, lots of UK Prime Ministers now just play it safe and go on holiday within the UK. But at least with the president, because they are taking their entire team, because they have the travelling press pool who are there, on site, I think there is more of a sense that it is a working vacation than this idea in the UK, which is still almost that a prime minister can effectively have close to a week off.
Holidays can have political peril as well for presidents. I'm just about old enough to remember Jimmy Carter, when he was president. Famously, he would go back to his peanut farm in Georgia and spend some time down there. And he, on one occasion, was out sort of paddling a canoe, I think it was, a boat in a lake near where he was. And it was an absolute sort of classic Jimmy Carter moment, which sort of completely epitomized his entire presidency, because he was actually, as it was related later by his Secret Service, he was attacked by a rabbit. This became known famously as the Jimmy Carter and the Killer Rabbit episode, when some apparently there's a certain sort of wild breed of rabbit down in Georgia or whatever, came sort of as he was getting out of his little boat or whatever, came and actually like sunk his teeth into him. So, and it was at a very low point in Jimmy Carter's presidency. So it just became the kind of iconic moment for Jimmy Carter. And, again, the contrast with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan would be out there with Nancy on his ranch in California, sitting astride a magnificent steed and, surveying everything before him. And there was Jimmy Carter kind of desperately trying to scurry away from a rabbit. But that's it for this week. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back again next week with another episode. In the meantime, from Katy Balls and me, thank you and have a great week.